Welcome, everyone, to the Ready for the Draft podcast. I am your host, Greg Schutz. This is episode 36 of the 2024 podcast series, where we take a look at the draft-eligible prospects and get you ready for the NFL draft. And the NFL draft has come and gone. We've seen all 257 picks come off the board, from Caleb Williams going number 1 overall to the Chicago Bears, through number 257, Mr. Irrelevant, Jalen Key, the safety out of Alabama, going to the New York Jets. And we spent the last two podcasts really taking a look at each of those draft picks and really how they fit in with their teams, the plans, what plans there may be for those guys, and really where we see the direction of the teams going now that they've brought in those guys to those franchises. Now it's time to take a different step, and we're going to take a look at the undrafted free agents, because look, even after the draft is over, after Mr. Irrelevant's name has been called, those scouting departments for all 32 teams, their job hasn't stopped. They have another critical job, and that's identifying the priority free agents, guys that they want to bring in onto their roster to not only fill out their roster for the mini camps and the training camps, but to also see if they can identify the diamond in the rough, the guy that they can either put on the practice squad and develop, or guys who could potentially make their opening day roster. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at each of the teams, all 32 of them, take a look at their rosters, and identify at least one undrafted free agent to keep an eye on, who can either find their way to the roster or at least to the practice squad, and a guy who could potentially continue to develop with their team. We're going to start with the Arizona Cardinals. And the guy I identified right off the bat was Xavier Weaver out of Colorado, formerly of USF. And this is a receiver who really took full advantage of his first year in Power 5 football play in the Pac-12 with the Buffs. 68 receptions, 908 yards, 4 touchdowns. He was really the go-to receiver for Shedeur Sanders, especially when Travis Hunter went down to his injury. 6 foot, 169 pounds, a guy who can get vertical on you. And when you look at this roster, I don't think that this receiving core is set. You've got Marvin Harrison Jr., you've got Michael Wilson. They drafted Twan Palmer, who they're expecting to be the vertical threat. They brought in Zay Jones as a veteran to this roster that's much needed. But then you have Greg Dortch, there's Chris Moore, Zach Pascal. Xavier Weaver is another vertical threat and a guy that I think could challenge for a roster spot. I think Twan Palmer did a lot of good things at UAB, but I think Weaver has a chance to even beat him out. I look at Chris Moore, more of a special teams guy, not going to make a huge impact catching the football. Zach Pascal's kind of bounced around to a few different organizations, but it's solid veteran. Greg Dortch is a guy that's going to line up in the slot. But I think Xavier Weaver has a chance at that receiver position. Another guy that I'm identifying here is Myles Murphy, the big defensive tackle out of North Carolina. This is a guy who is a space eater, but a guy that also can make some plays. Here's the thing. You look at this team and you've got Darius Robinson, Bilal Nichols, Justin Jones. That's your starting lineup, right? You got LJ Collier, who's been a first-round bust to this point. Kairis Tonga that they brought in as well, and Dante Stills. I mean, you brought in Nichols, Jones, and Tonga. You're really looking to address that front three. You got Roy Lopez as well. Myles Murphy has a chance, if nothing else, to be a practice squad guy, because I look at this group and Murphy and Lopez, Tonga, Stills, and Collier, these are guys that need to step up there and elevate their game. And I think Murphy's a guy that can at least push them along. And, I don't think he's going to make the roster by any means opening day, but a guy that could potentially make that practice squad. So a couple of guys there for Arizona. Then we move on to the Atlanta Falcons. And obviously we know what happened there with Michael Penix Jr. Edge rushers, they get Braylon Trice in round 3. They get Rukaroro, the D tackle. They end up going with another D tackle late in Zion Logue. I like the Brandon Dorless pick as well, a guy that can play both end and tackle. Could compete with Zach Harrison for a starting spot there. So I like the picks that they landed on early. Michael Penix Jr. again, if you're going to invest $100 million in Kirk Cousins, why are you investing in the future? The succession plan, I get it, but when you pay $100 million to a guy, that sounds like win now mode to me. So a little bit of a surprise there that they went that direction. But hey, I get what they're saying with we want to go ahead and play this out. Jaden Price of North Dakota State, 6 foot, 184 pounds, a corner. And when you look at this cornerback group, you've got Kevin King, Antonio Hamilton, Clark Phillips, along with AJ Terrell, D. Alford, Mike Hughes. I think Price is a guy that could compete for a spot, if nothing else, on the practice squad. Then I look at Austin Stogner, the big tight end out of Oklahoma. Yes, he transferred to South Carolina, but then back to Oklahoma. I'll tell you what, this was the most underwhelming year this past season. Really never regained his form from the COVID-shortened year there in 2020. 26 catches, 422 yards, and 3 touchdowns. That was 16.2 yards per reception. Really used a little bit differently in his final 2 seasons at Oklahoma, which really bookended and kind of sandwiched that 2022 visit there in South Carolina, where he followed Spencer Rattler as quarterback to the Gamecocks. But this is a guy, look, he can block, and I think he can be a receiving threat. When I look at him and I look at John Fitzpatrick, there's Ross Dwelly that they brought in as well, Charlie Werner. He has a chance to compete for that 3rd tight end spot. I think Charlie Werner's probably got the inside track to be that number 2. John Fitzpatrick, another guy that does a lot of the dirty work. That'll be a matchup to watch as we go into camp. Then we move on to the Baltimore Ravens. And look, Baltimore Ravens doing Baltimore Raven things. They stand pat at number 30. They get Nate Wiggins. And Nate Wiggins, we know, is a guy that is going to be a speedster out on the outside. He and Marlon Humphrey, along with Brandon Stevens, locking things down on the outside. Roger Rosengarten, they're patient. They sit there in round number 2. They need a right tackle. Thought they might get Amarius Mims. No, he's not there. They wait until round 2. Somehow Roger Rosengarten falls to them. Rosengarten, to me, is going to be their starting right tackle right off the bat. Then Adisa Isaac. They need an edge rusher. They need that edge rush help. You got to do Owe. There's David Ojabo. Ultimately, Kyle Van Noy is getting up there in age. So Adisa Isaac, love that pick as well. So a lot of good picks. Devontae Walker to solidify that receiving core. So you're identifying a lot of different players here on this roster. I'm looking at Julian Pearl out of Illinois. And this is a guy 6'6", 313 pounds, a guy that has that versatility to play both tackle and guard. I look at Patrick McCarry. Patrick McCarry right now is the backup for Ronnie Stanley on the left side. I think Julian Pearl has the athleticism to beat him out. I'm also looking at that right guard spot with Ben Cleveland. Josh Jones right now is penciled in as the backup there. I think Julian Pearl has the physicality to go along with that athleticism to potentially compete for that guard spot as well. That versatility is going to bode well for him with this group, and I don't see anybody that really is solidifying that status as a backup there, either at that left tackle spot or really at the guard spot. So I think Julian Pearl has a great chance to find his way onto this roster come week 1. Which moves us to the Buffalo Bills. And look, the Buffalo Bills, yes, they traded out of round 1. In fact, they even traded first with the Kansas City Chiefs. They get Xavier Worthy, but I think they got their number 1 in Keon Coleman. This was a pick that I mocked for a while and then went away from it. I probably should have stuck with it because it felt like the right pick. Just put on that game against LSU and that'll tell you all you need to know about Keon Coleman. And now, the personality, he's a fun interview for sure. Second round, Cole Bishop called that one. I think he's a guy that really fits what they want to do in that secondary now that Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde are gone. They needed a presence like that. I think Dwayne Carter's going to give him some versatility there at the defensive tackle spot. Ray Davis, I think, will ultimately be the backup there to James Cook. I know Ty Johnson and Darrington Evans are there, but I think he's a guy that can come in and take that spot. I think Cedric Van Pron Granger will probably be the replacement for Mitch Morse. They get him there in round number 5. So some solid picks. Javon Solomon, a sleeper there in round 5. They get that edge rusher. Love that pick. And then Edifon Olafosio, just another athletic linebacker for them. A guy, you got Matt Milano, you got Terrell Bernard, Dorian Williams, and then Edifon Olafosio. Love those picks. So who's the guy that I'm really identifying here for the Bills that's an undrafted free agent? I'm looking at Frank Gore. And no, not Frank Gore Sr., Frank Gore Jr. Out of Southern Miss. And this is a guy, he's not the biggest guy by any means. He's 5'8", but 201 pounds, so bowling ball type of guy like his father. But what you have there with Frank Gore Jr. is a guy who is, the contact balance, you see that. He's got the speed as well. Over 1,300 yards in 2022. Follows that up with another 1,100 yards, 26 total touchdowns in his career, 75 receptions with the Golden Eagles. And I think everybody knows Frank Gore for his performance in the bowl game in 2022. against Rice. Just showing off that athleticism and his game-breaking ability. I think that was something that really stood out in that game. All total, 21 carries, 329 yards, 15.7 yards per carry, and 2 touchdowns. This was a game that what was so explosive. It was really a way to showcase his ability. Had a 64-yard run in the second quarter, and then busted off another 55-yard run in the fourth. Those were his 2 touchdown runs, but this was a dude who really was a man on a mission. Looked like a man among boys. They just couldn't bring him down, couldn't tackle him, and just a guy. I mean, when you look at that, 329 yards, that really says something. I think that was a bowl record as well. So keep an eye out for Frank Gore Jr. When we look at this running back group, James Cook, Ty Johnson, Ray Davis, I think, and Darrington Evans. I think what you're looking at here is Ray Davis and Frank Gore as those 2 backups for James Cook. I think Ty Johnson, Darrington Evans, they're veterans, but I think ultimately they're looking for those cheaper options. Davis and Gore Jr. are those 2 guys that could step in and take those jobs. You look at Carolina, no first-round picks. We know this. They wound up trading into round 1 to get Xavier Legette. First off, the interviews are going to be awesome. But then you look at his playmaking ability, and this is a guy that has the ability to be a number 1. Yes, I know Adam Thielen was on there, 1,000-yard receiver a season ago, but I think Xavier Legette has the tools, has the goods to be a number 1 wideout. They get Jonathan Brooks right now. Okay, you got Chuba Hubbard, you got Miles Sanders. I think Jonathan Brooks, once that knee is 100%, he's going to be that starter at that running back spot. You get Trevin Wallace in round number 3. I think the heir apparent to Shaq Thompson. Then Jatavion Sanders, the tight end. I think he'll ultimately supplant Tommy Tremble as that starting tight end as well. So a lot of solid picks here overall. One guy I'm going to kind of go out on an island here, if you will. I'm looking at Jackson Mitchell out of UConn. I've been a fan of Jackson Mitchell's for the last couple of years, and he's just a tackling machine. He's always around the football, 6'2", 229 pounds, 432 tackles in his career, 24.5 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks, 3 interceptions, 7 pass breakups, 6 forced fumbles in his career. Just has a nose for the football. Now, when you look at him, obviously you've got Shaq Thompson and Josie Jewell starting. You drafted Trevin Wallace. Michael Barrett was drafted in round number 7. There's Chandler Wooten on the roster as well. I think Jackson Mitchell has a chance to compete with Barrett and Wooten to be that 4th inside linebacker, and I think he could be a special teams ace. The other guy I'm looking at is Andrew Rame out of Oklahoma, because you know that Austin Corbett, likely this is his last year in Carolina, and with Andrew Rame, 6'4", 315 pounds, a physical presence there at the center spot. I think Brady Christensen may be the backup there, and possibly Cade Mays. But Christensen, he started out as a tackle coming out of BYU, was at a guard spot. Now he's moved to the pivot. I know there's some versatility there, but I think Andrew Rame is a true center. And I think he's a guy that could ultimately not only work his way onto a roster spot, but a guy that I think will end up as a starter there, has a good chance at least to be a starter, replacing Austin Corbett down the line. You get to the Chicago Bears, only 5 picks, but I think they nailed every single one. Obviously, Caleb Williams, you know how I feel about him. I'm a Trojan alum, a big Caleb Williams fan, and then he gets a go-to target with Rome Odunze. He's going to be his number 1. I mean, yes, you've got DJ Moore and you've got Keenan Allen. Those are veterans, but look, Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze could be playing together a long, long time, and it's going to be a lot of fun to watch the 2 of them. You got Kieran Amagadije out of Yale. This is a dude who is a swing tackle. He's athletic. I think he's a little bit of a project, but he's got that athleticism. Braxton Jones and Darnell Wright, the starters right now, but I think Karan is a guy that's going to provide some depth there, and if there are any injuries, he can slide right into that starting spot. Torrey Taylor, this is was Iowa's best offensive player. He can really flip the field for your defense. So I know Caleb Williams called him and said, hey, or texted him and said, you're not going to punt very often, but if you run into a situation where you need a big leg and a guy that can deliver, Torrey Taylor under pressure situations all the time. Austin Booker, 8 sacks in his first year at Kansas after starting out his career at Minnesota. Redshirt sophomore, but a lot to like there. Very athletic. Look, you've got DeMarcus Walker there opposite Montez Sweat. I think Austin Booker can work and potentially find his way into a battle there, potentially for a starting spot down the road, though. When I look at this roster and I look at guys to potentially identify as an undrafted free agent on this roster, I look at Jamari Chroma. I already talked about DeMarcus Walker. I talked about Austin Booker. There's Dominique Robinson, Khalid Kareem, Jacob Martin. A lot of different veterans on the team that are going to be competing for a spot. But with Jamari Chroma, he's one of those guys that kind of flew under the radar. He's 6'4", 275 pounds, and started his career at Rutgers. But this past season at James Madison, dude, with the Dukes, 19.5 tackles for loss, 10 sacks, 59 total tackles as well. Which is just staggering for a guy that's playing that defensive tackle position. And this was a guy who was number 3 on the team in total tackles as a defensive lineman. That's really impressive. And so when I look at this group up front, I think that Chroma has a chance to work his way onto this roster. Another guy that I really like is Leon Jones. Leon Jones is a corner out of Arkansas State. And 6'1", 192 pounds. This guy has excellent ball skills, 20 pass breakups in his career. I think the biggest concern with him was just the one interception, and that came in his sophomore season. So obviously, can he be a playmaker around the football? But you look at the cornerback spot, you got Terrell Smith, Jalen Jones, Kyler Gordon to go along with the starters, Jalen Johnson and Tyreek Stevenson. I think Jones and then Reddy Stewart on the opposite side. These are two guys that even if they don't end up making the roster, I think they're practice squad material, and then one of them could end up getting picked up by somebody else. 5'11", 173 with Reddy Stewart from Troy, 32 pass breakups in his career, 9 interceptions, including 3 that he returned for touchdown in his career. Very active corner, and I think he's a guy that, I look at Josh Blackwell, Greg Stroman as the backups there at nickel. I think Reddy Stewart, he can play on the outside, but if you're looking for a backup at the nickel, Reddy Stewart could potentially be that guy. So there are quite a few options there in Chicago, which takes us to Cincinnati. Cincinnati, some questionable picks. They take Amarius Mims at 18, which I think was a smart move because if nothing else, when you look at Mims, he's a guy that can eventually take over for Trent Brown, who signed to just a 1-year deal there in Cincy. I can learn from the veteran. Chris Jenkins, you get that defensive tackle presence. He's a guy that Sheldon Rankins is there right now, but I think Jenkins is a guy that could end up working his way as a starter next season. McKinley Jackson is a guy that takes up a lot of space, but I wasn't a huge fan of his. Round 3 was a little bit too high for me. Jermaine Burton as the receiver. You've got T. Higgins on that franchise tag. You've got Trenton Irwin. You need help for Jamar Chase. Charlie Jones didn't make the impact that they were expecting. I thought there were other receivers out there. Devontae Walker would have been a little bit more exciting than Jermaine Burton. Eric All in the fourth round. They needed a tight end. I thought they were going to go after Jared Wiley. Eric All could be a solid tight end if he stays healthy. He's had a back injury, a knee injury, missed a couple of seasons. That's the big concern that I have. I actually like Tanner McLaughlin coming off the board in round number 6. When you look at this tight end group, Mike Gesicki, Drew Sample, Tanner Hudson, I think McLaughlin's one of those guys that could slide in here and potentially steal a roster spot when it's all said and done. So when I look at this group, we look at the undrafted free agents, I'm going to target Aaron Casey out of Indiana. And with Aaron Casey, this guy, very active linebacker on a Hoosier defense that struggled with any consistency, but this guy was a model of consistency. 109 tackles this past season, 20 going for loss, 6.5 sacks. So he showed his ability to start getting after the quarterback. 3 pass breakups, 3 forced fumbles as well. Casey is a guy that, we saw him at the combine, 4.7, 540, not the fastest, but 6'1", 231 pounds. And again, when I look at Cincy and their linebackers, this is a guy that, to me, you talk about instinctive guys that make a lot of plays. Jermaine Pratt, Logan Wilson were those guys coming out of NC State and Wyoming, respectively. Akeem Gaither, another one of those guys. I look at Aaron Casey, I think he can beat out Joe Bocci as the backup there to Logan Wilson. Keep an eye on number 44 there for the Bengals. Cleveland, no first round pick. I love getting Michael Hall Jr. in round number 2 addresses that D tackle spot. I think Zach Zinter is another guy that you can target to eventually replace one of the 2 guards, whether it's Wyatt Teller or Joel Bitonio. I like that pick. I look at Javion Coleman out of Miami, a guy that started his career at Alabama, moved on to Miami. This is a guy that can get it done both in the run game and as a pass protector. Inconsistency was a big concern, obviously. 6'4", 324 pounds, not the most athletic of the guys that showed up there at the combine, but a guy that I think could work his way in and be a solid backup for them. So that's who I have as a guy to watch in Cleveland. Dallas, I loved a lot of their picks. First 3 for sure. Tyler Guyton, going to be that left tackle. I almost mocked him to Dallas, but I wasn't sure about him at the left tackle spot. Look, they, who am I to question them? They go after Tyler Smith. He's a guy that played both tackle and guard for them. Looks like an absolute keeper for them. Tyler Guyton at left tackle. Marshawn Nealon there in round number 2. He's a guy that could potentially replace DeMarcus Lawrence there at the defensive end spot, and then getting Cooper Beebe. This is a guy who played tackle and guard for K-State. Really was guard was his position. A guy that, man, if you got him out in space, either climbing to the second level or pulling around, this was the guy that you just did not want to see coming downhill on you. And I think he's a guy that could end up playing the pivot. They need a replacement for Tyler Biadasz, and I think Cooper Beebe could end up being the starter there. Brock Hoffman was an undrafted free agent. I think played with Cleveland. Now he's there in Dallas. I think Cooper Beebe ends up taking over that spot. So if I were to look at the Kalen Carson, another corner, I think he's a guy that will be that backup there to Trevon Diggs and Deron Bland. As long as he can stay healthy, I think he's a guy that could end up being a playmaker there for them as well. So looking at their guys, who to identify, what can we potentially target? And I think Brevin Spann-Ford is intriguing. He's 6'6", 260 pounds there out of Minnesota, a guy that just oozes potential, but the production just never was there. I think there's some question marks with his hands at times, inconsistent pass catcher, not always, even in the red zone. You watched him at the Senior Bowl. I think Cole Bishop really ate him up. So there are some question marks there to his game. But when I look at the tight end spot, you've got Jake Ferguson, you've got Luke Schoonmaker. Peyton Hendershot is that number 3 tight end. Can Spann-Ford showcase his ability to be a blocker? So I think that's really what this group is lacking, is a true blocker. Ferguson is a pass catcher first, even though he was a solid blocker at Wisconsin. I think ultimately Spann-Ford, that's really what he's hoping for. They've got a fullback in Hunter Lepke if they decide they want to do a 2 running back set. So it's not like Spann-Ford could even jump into the backfield or play H-back or anything like that. I think his true shot is really at that practice squad spot, and a guy that they can bring up to the roster in the event of an injury. But that's really where I see him falling. There's so much potential there. It's just he just hasn't really showcased that ability at that FBS level. So then you go to Denver, obviously with Bo Nix, and they bring in Troy Franklin in the 4th round. How Troy Franklin fell all the way to round number 4, I have no idea. Maybe it was that gauntlet where he was weaving in and out. That's entirely possible just watching the way that he ran that drill. But I'm looking at Blake Watson out of Memphis. You've got Javonte Williams, Samaje Perine, Jaleel McLaughlin. You bring in Audric Estime, who's a lot like Samaje Perine, and then you bring in Blake Watson, who's a lot like Jaleel McLaughlin. And that's where I'm looking at this going, you know what? I think it's setting up to have these guys ultimately replace the veterans. Blake Watson's about 5'9", 195, something like that. Over 900 yards at at Old Dominion. And then at Memphis, over 1,100 yards, 6 yards per carry, 14 touchdowns, and 90 receptions in the last two seasons with the Monarchs and then with the Tigers. This is a guy that I think ultimately is going to find his way onto the roster. And like I said, I think Williams, Estime, Watson, that could be your trio in the backfield in Denver. Which takes us to Detroit. You've got Terrion Arnold, you've got Ennis Rakestraw, really solidified that cornerback position, which was a definite need area for the Lions. Now, if we look at this roster, we look at a guy to identify. I'm looking at Isaiah Williams out of Illinois. This was a guy that I thought was going to get drafted, potentially even as high as round number 5. 5'9", 186. Don't pay attention to the 40 time. This is a guy that I think he's quicker than he is fast. Ran that 4.63, which is incredibly disappointing, but he runs that 3-cone drill in 6.75, which I think was the third fastest among the receivers who ran the drill. At 5'9", 182, the 40 time is concerning, but he is quicker than he is fast. When you look at this receiving core, you've got Jamison Williams, you've got Khalif Raymond, and obviously, the man, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. After that, who's going to be the fourth receiver? Is Donovan Peoples-Jones, who came from Cleveland? You got Antoine Green, there's Tom Kennedy. I think Isaiah Williams has a chance to end up being that fourth or fifth receiver on this roster. Which takes us then to the Green Bay Packers. Green Bay, some questionable picks, and really, just the one at the top, Jordan Morgan. Taking him at 25 overall, I think that was more of a surprise than anything else. This is a guy who's going to end up being a day one starter at the left tackle spot, taking over for David Bakhtiari. But I love the second round picks. You get Edgerrin Cooper and Javon Bullard, both starters. Marshawn Lloyd's going to supplant A.J. Dillon as the backup for Josh Jacobs. Tyron Hopper, Evan Williams, going to provide depth at the linebacker and safety spot. So I really love what Green Bay did in the draft. Then when you look at the undrafted free agents, Trente Jones was going to be my guy, but I saw that he's on the retired list, so I can't go in that direction. They're really limited in terms of the other guys to identify on this group, really, because they did such a solid job with their draft. They brought in a lot of guys to address their issues. If anything, I'm looking at the long slapper, Peter Bowden out of Wisconsin, 6'2", 239. They have Matt Orzik that's in there right now. This is a guy that's bounced around quite a bit. He's been with Baltimore, Jacksonville, Miami, Tennessee, the Rams. Now he's been with Green Bay. This is a guy that I think ultimately I look at Peter Bowden, and I think Bowden is a guy that can end up finding his way onto the roster. There's going to be a competition there, but I think Bowden, what he's been able to do at Wisconsin, I think there's a chance that you could see him stepping in as Green Bay's long snapper. Houston, no first round pick. That's okay. Obviously with Daniil Hunter and Stephon Diggs, they hit home runs this offseason. So when you look at this group, Kamari Lassiter, starter at corner in round 2. Blake Fisher going to be a starter at right tackle in round 2. Kalen Bullock, in round 3, he'll be an eventual starter. He'll take over for Jimmy Ward. Cade Stover going to be the backup there to Dalton Schultz. You get that 2 tight end set. Really like a lot of the picks that Houston had, addressing some spots and finding some future starters on day 2 and day 3. So when I look at the group and I try to identify somebody that I want to go after, how about Feldarius Payne? When you look at the D tackle spot, you've got Danico Autry and Foley Fatukasi, Tim Settle, Mario Edwards. I think Fatukasi, Settle, and Edwards, if I'm not mistaken, are on 1-year deals. You're going to be looking for somebody that you can bring into the roster and a guy that you can develop and a guy that can hopefully get after the quarterback a little bit. A little undersized, 6'3", 260, but 10 tackles for loss, 4 sacks in his first year at Virginia Tech after transferring from Nebraska. So I look at Payne. He's a guy that is intriguing, and I think with DeMeco Ryans, I think it's a good pairing for him and potentially find a way onto that roster. Indianapolis, the Colts. I love Chris Ballard laughing that Leatu Latu fell to them at number 15, the best defensive player in the draft, best edge rusher. How does that happen? Then they get Adonai Mitchell, a solid receiver there in round number 2. Going to compete with Alec Pierce to be that number 3 receiver with Josh Downs and obviously Michael Pittman Jr. as wide receiver 1. Matt Goncalves in round 3, he's going to be your swing tackle. Tanner Bortolini is a guy that can play a lot of different positions. Anthony Gould is going to be a nice slot receiver. Jalen Carlisle is a guy that I think could compete with EJ Speed at that will spot, that will linebacker. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out for sure. When I look at this group, trying to identify someone, I think ultimately, I look at Trent Penix. If you're talking about potentially bringing on a fullback, Trent Penix is a guy that can be versatile. He's 6'1", 234 pounds, played fullback, played H-back, played tight end, a lot of different positions while at NC State. So he's one of those guys to keep an eye on depending on the direction that they want to go. Also, when you look at the quarterback position, right, you got Joe Flacco. Joe Flacco, they brought up, he was basically sitting on his couch and ultimately came in for Cleveland. Now he's there in Indy, hopefully there to help bring along Anthony Richardson. Sam Ellinger's on the roster as well. Keaton Slovis out of BYU. This is a guy who, look, he was solid there at SC. 68% completion percentage, but he really was never the same after that Holiday Bowl when he took that hit to that arm from AJ Epinesa. So there was no issue with the shoulder, but I beg to differ. You watch his completion percentage and it dropped year after year. Gets to Pitt, and just 58.4% completion percentage, 10 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. BYU played in only 8 games. The injuries are a major concern, especially the concussions. 12 touchdowns, 6 interceptions for the Cougs, just 1,700 yards passing. But the thing with Keaton Slovis, he showed up at the combine, showed off tremendous athleticism, 6'2", 223, 4.55 40, which was fastest among the quarterbacks who ran the 40. A bit of a surprise. I thought the arm strength, though, was average. The ball hung up in the air a little bit. But he's one of those guys that could be one of those career backups. He's an intelligent guy. Could he be that third quarterback on the roster? Keep an eye on him potentially falling to Indy's practice squad. Jacksonville. Brian Thomas Jr., you look at that receiving core. This made a lot of sense. I had it mocked for a while, ultimately moved off of that. But, you've got Gabe Davis and Christian Kirk. Thomas gives you that vertical threat to help open things up for that team. Love that pick. Mason Smith, I think he and new defensive coordinator Ryan Nielsen, that could be a potential match made in heaven, home run pick. Jarian Jones is going to compete with Tyson Campbell potentially for that starting spot. And Javon Foster is a guy that I think if Brandon Sheriff falters again, Javon Foster, even though he was the left tackle at Mizzou, he could slide in and potentially take over at that right guard spot. Because look, that's what Sheriff did, right? He moved on from Iowa as a left tackle, played guard, and was a Pro Bowl, all-pro guard. So there are some solid picks there for Jacksonville. So when I look at this group, though, the guy that I want to identify as an undrafted free agent is Joshua Cephas out of UTSA. And Joshua Cephas, this is a guy who just continues to get better and better for the Roadrunners each and every year. He was on a team with Zachary Franklin, DeCorian Clark, guys that were a little bit more heralded than him. He stuck it out, even though Clark got injured. Franklin transferred to Ole Miss. Cephas stuck it out, 6'3", 190 pounds, over 1,100 yards this past season, 10 touchdowns. Just continued, like I said, to get better and better each and every year. Caught over 300 passes, 3,600 yards in his career, 28 touchdowns. Had some off-field issues, which is likely why he wasn't drafted, but he looked solid in the East-West Shrine game. Really, really like that pick. Potentially to make that roster. When you look at the receiving core, I mentioned Davis, Thomas, and Kirk. You've got Duvernay, you've got Parker Washington. I think Cephas is another guy who's going to compete with Tim Jones, Elijah Cooks, Seth Williams to be that number 6 receiver. See how all of that plays out. KC. Mentioned Xavier Worthy, you get the speed. You've got Kingsley Suamataia to be that left tackle, compete with Wanye Morris. Jared Wiley in round 4 to be that number 2 tight end for behind Travis Kelce. Then you've got Jaden Hicks, a safety who can also play that linebacker spot. So I love the depth that they were getting there in KC. Not a ton of picks, but I thought they used them wisely. So if I'm having to identify a guy in this group, undrafted free agent, there are a couple of names that definitely jump out for me. But I look at Curtis Jacobs out of Penn State. I think he's going to be that backup there for Nick Bolton. I think that just makes so much sense. This is a guy that flies around and just makes a ton of plays. Plays incredibly fast, 6'1", 229, 9 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks this past season, 9.5 in his career, 24 total tackles for loss. A guy, like I said, flies around, makes plays, instinctive linebacker. That athleticism reminds you a little bit of Nick Bolton. So I think he's a guy that's absolutely primed to make this roster as that backup at the mic. Chargers. I mean, what can you say about the first 3 picks? Joe Alt, starter at right tackle. Lab McConkey, starter at receiver. Junior Colson, I think ultimately he's going to be the starter there at inside linebacker. I think he'll ultimately supplant Denzel Perryman and will play with Deion Henley on the inside, the interior of that linebacking core. I think Cam Hart really gives you excellent depth at the cornerback spot. Tarheeb Still is the guy that's probably going to compete with Jasir Taylor at that nickel. Kamani Vidal. Shoot, this is a guy. You look at J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards. I like Kamani Vidal as that number three running back. Brendan Rice and Cornelius Johnson just gives you a couple of bigger receivers, adds depth to that wide receiver spot. So if I'm looking at a guy on this roster that I want to target, I think the number one guy for me is probably Carson Barnhart. This is another Michigan guy, and I look at Braden James, I look at Jordan McFadden, Carson Barnhart, a guy who has versatility, can play both guard and tackle. Although we saw him against Penn State, cannot handle Chop Robinson's speed, so those twitchy edge rushers a problem for him on the outside, which is why he's going to play guard. And I look at obviously Zion Johnson, Jamari Sawyer as the starters. I think Carson Barnhart has a chance to be a backup there in LA. And one other name to throw out there is Tremont Morris Brash. I think there's, it's going to be difficult to make this team, especially when you're looking at Bosa, Mack, Bud Dupree, Tuli Tuipulotu, Chris Rumpf. If you have 6 edge rushers, then potentially Tremont Morris Brash is the guy that can make the roster. The thing with Tremont is he's an undersized edge rusher, right? 6'2", 245, but incredibly productive. 57.5 tackles for loss, 25 sacks, including 8 this past season. Went with 20.5 tackles for loss for UCF. And so I just look at that production. He's one of those guys, even if they decide, all right, we're not going to carry a ton of these guys going into week one, edge rushers. He's a guy that should make their practice squad easily, and a guy that I think could end up finding his way onto an NFL roster somewhere, if they're looking for a rotational piece to get after the quarterback and make plays around the line of scrimmage. The LA Rams, look, I love what they did. Obviously when you have Aaron Donald, you lose him. You need to replace him. You also need to put pressure on the quarterback. And so when I look at getting Jared Verse in round 1, then Braden Fisk in round 2, two guys who are going to start. Now you're looking at Fisk playing with Kobe Turner up front, with Jared Verse and Byron Young on the outside. Love those picks. You get Brennan Jackson to be a backup there on the outside. You got Blake Corum to back up Kyron Williams. Cameron Kinchins, to me, is going to be a starter next to Cameron Curl. At the free safety spot, I think he'll beat out Russ East. Tyler Davis will be a backup there at the defensive tackle spot. And you get Joshua Carty, your place kicker. When I look at this group, though, and I look at the undrafted free agents, I'll give you a name. It's going to sound familiar because of his Hall of Fame father, and that's Drake Stoops. The son of OU legend Bob Stoops. I look at this receiving core: Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, Demarcus Robinson, Tutu Atwell. Those are your 4 guys, right? Jordan Whittington, I think this is a guy who ultimately, he reminds you of a guy that could be like a Josh Reynolds. Ben Skoranek left the team, was released. So you look at Jordan Whittington potentially taking over for that spot. Tyler Johnson is another veteran on the roster, but I'm looking at Drake Stoops, and he's a guy, look, if they want to keep 6 wide receivers, it's going to be hard to keep Drake Stoops off the roster. Didn't matter which quarterback he played for, whether it was Kyler Murray, Spencer Rattler, Caleb Williams, Dylan Gabriel, or Jackson Arnold. They all loved getting this guy the football. This past season, 84 catches, 962 yards, 10 touchdowns. This dude just, he's gritty. He's tough. He's fearless. Go over the middle, lay out for you, take a big hit. Guy that just, the heart. That's really the big thing. And he's not 5'10". He's well under that. 190 pounds. But man, this Sooner, he bleeds crimson and cream, and I think he's a guy that what you're going to see is he'll become a favorite target there for Matthew Stafford, for Stetson Bennett. Anybody who's playing quarterback there is going to love throwing the football to Drake Stoops, and I think he ends up making the roster. Vegas, they sat there at round 1. No quarterbacks. Hey, you got Gardner Minshew, you've got Aiden O'Connell. Those will be your quarterbacks this year. They'll probably be primed to potentially take either Carson Beck or Shedeur Sanders next year. They ultimately take the best player available, and that was Brock Bowers. Even though you have Michael Mayer on the roster, Jackson Powers Johnson's going to play the guard spot. I thought it was a little high to take Delmar Glaze, but I think ultimately he'll be a backup there to Thayer Mumford at the right tackle spot. So some interesting picks. I think Dylan Lobby, the running back, he's going to be your Danny Woodhead, if you will. So this running back group, Zamir White, Alexander Madison, Amir Abdullah, a lot of veterans, but nobody who's going to really set the stage on fire. So I think Dylan Lobby has a good chance there. When I look at this group, I think Andrew Coker out of TCU is an interesting pick. 6'7", 315 pounds. He's a guy that has some versatility to play both sides of the line. Andrus Peat, Cody Whitehair signed as veterans, right? Peat can play both tackle and guard. Whitehair can play both guard and center. I look at Coker. He's a guy that, hey, he can potentially compete there and be that backup to Colton Miller at left tackle, with Delmar Glaze likely the backup there on the right side. Coker, tremendous size, again, and length at 6'7", 315 pounds. He's an intriguing guy. And then Ron Stone Jr. out of Washington State. This is a guy that his motor never quits. When you've got Max Crosby, Malcolm Kuntz, I think after that, really the door's open. Janarius Robinson, Ellerson Smith, Charles Snowden. Who's going to be that guy that's going to step up? And Ron Stone, he and Brennan Jackson, running mates there for the Cougs. He was a little undersized at 6'3", 240, really more of a 34 outside linebacker, if you ask me. But 16 sacks, 31 and a half tackles for loss. And this was a guy who, I thought, early on in the year, he was really, really explosive, really productive. A guy that could really showcase his ability to bend coming off the edge. 2 sacks against Wisconsin really made Jack Nelson look silly. 2 forced fumbles. I think those were both on those sacks as well. So he's the guy that I think has a chance to end up making that roster, especially if Tyree Wilson is kicking inside to that deep tackle spot. I think that's a way for Ron Stone to potentially find his way onto that roster. Miami. Chop Robinson, you get the guy, obviously you get him and Muhammad Kamara. Edge rushers, you're worried about Brandon Chubb and Jalen Phillips with their ACL and Achilles injuries, respectively. So when I look at this group and I look at who we could potentially address, there are 2 guys: Grayson Murphy, the twin of Gabriel Murphy, and I think both Gabriel and Grayson, being undrafted, they're both guys who I think are primed to end up making rosters. But with Grayson, he was the guy that ultimately coming out of out of North Texas was primed really to be that he was more explosive. 14 and a half tackles for loss, 8 and a half sacks. He actually had a better start to his career than his brother. His brother really came on there at UCLA. But when I look at this group, even when Phillips and Chubb are healthy, you've got Shaq Barrett, there's Chop Robinson, you have Muhammad Kamara, Cameron Good's on the roster, but I think Grayson Murphy has a chance to end up being that other guy. So when Phillips and Chubb are down, he has a great chance to find his way onto the roster, and then if nothing else, he gets kicked to the practice squad. Like a Storm Duck, the corner out of North Carolina, then to Louisville. You got Kendall Fuller, you got Jalen Ramsey, but then after that, there are some question marks. I think Storm Duck is a guy that could find his way onto the roster. If not, then the practice squad, but I think he's a guy that has those ball skills that are evident. He's a guy that can make his way onto that roster. Minnesota, love what they did at the top of the draft. They got their quarterback. They only had to trade up 1 spot to get J.J. McCarthy. How in the world Dallas Turner was still on the board at 17? Minnesota jumped at the chance to get the guy who could potentially replace their guy in Danielle Hunter, who's gone. You've got Jonathan Bernard, and you also have Andrew Van Ginkel. But I mentioned Gabriel Murphy, and I look at Gabriel Murphy. I think he could compete with Jihad Ward, Andre Carter, Pat Jones II. I think Gabriel Murphy makes this roster. He's so explosive coming off the edge there for the Bruins, and you had Latu on one side, but Murphy was just he was equally explosive at times. 16 tackles for loss, 8 sacks. Truly a guy that was a situational pass rusher. But I think for the next level, at least starting out, until he gets better at the run. A little undersized, 6'2", 247 pounds, but ran that 4.68 40, 39.5-inch vertical leap. Also put up 225 times, which I believe was the most among all the guys that were lined up at linebacker in the combine. So I think Gabriel Murphy's the guy that's going to end up making that roster. I look at New England. Obviously, Drake May. You knew that was coming. Surprising picks with Jalen Polk. They're in round 2. I thought maybe they were going to go receiver in round 3, go with the tackle in round 2. Caden Wallace, is he going to be your starter in New England at the or the left tackle spot? We're going to have to see how all of that plays out. I think Chuck Okorafor will likely be that left tackle, but Wallace will be the backup. So when I look at the group, ultimately I'm looking at Charles Turner the third. David Andrews, he's the starter, but he's also 31 years of age. So the question is, how much longer is he going to be the guy there in New England? I think Turner is a guy that's going to compete with Andrews for a potential starting spot. The biggest thing with him is his technique can get sloppy at times. I think he's a good enough athlete to find his way onto that roster. 6'4", 303, can get a little lazy with his hands at times. So I think he's the guy that, again, that athleticism, you get with some NFL coaching, he's the guy that could end up finding his way onto that, not only onto that roster, but being a backup there for David Andrews, beating out Jake Andrews. New Orleans, Taliesin Fuaga. There's your, I think because he's a better pass blocker than he is a run blocker, I think he'll end up being a left tackle for them. Beat out Trevor Penning. You've got Kool-Aid McKinstry, that provides some depth there at the cornerback spot. So a couple of good picks there at the top of the draft. Questionable taking Spencer Rattler when you already have Jake Haener on the roster. That was kind of weird for me. But if I look at their undrafted free agents, and who I want to potentially identify and call out, I think Dallin Holker is the guy, right? You got Jawan Johnson, who started to come on. He was a receiver at Oregon. Foster Moreau does the dirty work. You got Taysom Hill still on the roster, but Dallin Holker, this is a guy that always found a way to get behind the defense. He's not the fastest guy by any means. You saw him there at the combine. Was one of the slowest. He actually ran the slowest time among all the tight ends at 4.78. He's 6'3", 241. But man, short shuttle, 4.21. Second fastest among the tight ends. 6'8", 3.3 cone drill. Second fastest among the tight ends. 0.01 seconds behind Ben Sinnott, who ended up coming off the board in round number 2. I look at Dallin Holker. He was an older guy. I think he's going to be 24, 25. Went to BYU, had a 2-year mission. Ends up transferring to Colorado State for the 2023 season. 64 catches, 767 yards, 6 touchdowns for the Rams. Kean and Torrey Horton, who's going to be an exceptional receiver in this year's draft class. But I look at Holker. I think he's a guy that has a great chance to make the roster there in New Orleans. The Giants don't go quarterback, which I think was smart, because it doesn't matter who played quarterback. You need that number 1 wideout. You get Malik Neighbors. I love the Tyler Nubin pick. He'll start at safety. You got Andrew Phillips. Drew Phillips will probably be the starter at the nickel, and then Theo Johnson is going to be that backup tight end for the G-men backing up Darren Waller. So if I had to identify an undrafted free agent, I swear I say that over and over again as I look through all of this, but I think Casey Rogers is the guy that kind of jumps out to me a little bit. And with Casey Rogers, he's a big defensive tackle, started his career at Nebraska, then moved to Oregon. Athletic, 6'4", 300. Don't look at the stats. The stats aren't going to wow you. This is a guy, again, who's extremely athletic, a guy that can plug the middle, but can also be disruptive around the line of scrimmage. So he's the guy that I look for potentially making the practice squad. Jets. Olu Fashanu, there's your left tackle, heir apparent to Tyron Smith, who's going to be the left tackle this year. But, it made sense. You bring him in because, frankly, Tyron Smith has missed 34 games over the last 4 seasons. You get Malachi Corley at the receiver spot. Curious pick, though, Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis. You already have Breece Hall and Izzy Abanikanda, so then you get those 2 guys who are virtually the same running back in a lot of cases. I think Isaiah Davis is actually a better receiver than Braylon Allen, so it's interesting what you have going on there. But undrafted free agents, looking at this group, ultimately what I'm looking at, there are three guys on defense. Leonard Taylor III at D tackle. He has a chance. Obviously, he'll have to compete with Bruce Hector, Tanzel Smart, because I think you got Kinlaw, Javon Kinlaw, Quinnen Williams, Lecky Fotu, and Solomon Thomas. They're basically the four guys. Leonard Taylor has all the athleticism in the world, but he's a guy that I thought was inconsistent. Pad level creeped up way too often, and if that happened, he was done. There was zero counter moves with this guy. 6'3", 303, ran a 5.12 40 at the combine. Again, athleticism, can they get him to elevate his game? I mentioned three. You're talking about Braden McGregor out of Michigan, a guy who has tremendous length. The production, I think the potential versus the production for him, that's really kind of the big thing that kind of stands out. 6'5", 257, needs to really put on some size. That's really kind of his thing, because he's not overpowering. He's not incredibly twitchy. He's not overpowering. But look, had 2 sacks against Alabama in the college football playoff semi. And then you've got Eric Watts out of UConn. 6'6", 274, 35 3/4 inch arms, 4'6", 40, 36.5 inch vertical leap. And the thing with Eric Watts, I think this is a solid player. UConn they've got him, they've got Christian Haynes, and they've got Jackson Mitchell, all guys that I think can compete at the next level. 23 tackles for loss, 9.5 sacks, 4 forced fumbles in his career. I think Watts is a guy, when you look at, you've got Jermaine Johnson, Hassan Reddick, Will McDonald IV, Michael Clemens. If you're going with the 5th defensive end, I think Watts actually right now has the edge over Braden McGregor in New York with the Jets. Eagles, how in the world does Quinyon Mitchell fall to them at 22? And then how does Cooper DeJean fall to them at 40? The rich keep getting richer. That secondary, they needed an infusion of youth. They get it with Mitchell and DeJean. I think Jalix Hunt is a nice edge rusher who can develop behind guys like Brandon Graham. Will Shipley, I think, will be the backup to Saquon Barkley. I've got Kenneth Gainwell, but I think Will Shipley can end up taking over that job. And somehow they get Jeremiah Trotter Jr., the legacy there with the Eagles. He'll ultimately be that starter next to Nakobe Dean when it's all said and done there in Philly. I love Denia Smith and Johnny Wilson. You get a guy who can play the slot, and then the bigger receiver on the outside. Johnny Wilson just needs to play up to his potential. They've got Devontae Parker on the roster. Hopefully he'll be able to take him under his wing and kind of help him along. I think there has a chance there. I look at Gabe Davis, undrafted free agent. You've got Milton Williams, Moro Ojimo at that defensive end spot, but I think Gabe Hall has a great chance to be that backup to Milton Williams. He's 6'5", 290 pounds, 16.5 tackles for loss, 11.5 sacks. The guy that really came on in 2021 with 7 tackles for loss, 5 sacks. We saw him win in a variety of ways, both with power and with speed at the Senior Bowl. And I said, he's actually 6'6", 291, ran a 5.03 40. There's pretty good athleticism, and a guy that I think, at 34 defensive end and play that 5 technique. I think Gabe Hall has a great chance to be that backup to Milton Williams there in Philly. Steelers, Troy Fatanu, Zach Frazier, you get your left tackle, you get your pivot, and then Roman Wilson's going to be that number 2 for George Pickens, and then somehow they get Peyton Wilson there at the end of round number 3. I'm a huge fan of Peyton Wilson's. I think if he had no medical issues, no red flags there on that side, he could have been a first-round pick, much like Jack Campbell. Mason McCormick, another guy who I think could be a starter at either guard or center, so definitely gives him some depth there up front. A guy who I think could potentially supplant Isaac Somalo as that left guard starter at some point in his career. If I'm looking for a guy that I can identify here, I'm looking at Beanie Bishop. You've got Darius Rush, who's the starter at the nickel, but Josiah Scott, Thomas Graham Jr., I don't think either of them have really separated themselves by any means. Beanie Bishop is a guy who was a playmaker. He was the guy who started his career at Western Kentucky, moved to Minnesota at 5'10", 175 pounds. This guy, though, when he was at West Virginia, there was a joke that this guy just needed to hang on to the football. He had 4 interceptions, 20 pass breakups, And the thing with it was we could have had even more interceptions, those 20 pass breakups. He probably could have had 3 or 4 more interceptions. He just put himself in a place to make plays. He just didn't hold on to the football. But he's definitely a guy who has ball skills, has those instincts. He's a guy that I think could end up finding his way as that backup nickel to Darius Rush. Seattle. I thought maybe they go with Troy Fautanu there at the guard spot, especially with Ryan Grubb as the offensive coordinator. Instead, they go with Byron Murphy II. He's a guy that I think could team with Leonard Williams. Love that pick. Christian Haynes is going to be a day one starter at the guard spot. Tyrus Knight, I think, will ultimately take over for that inside backer spot from Tyrell Dodson. AJ Barner is going to fill that Will Dissly role as well. And I think, you look at a couple of corners, not Nehemiah Pritchett, DJ James. These are 2 guys that are going to provide some excellent depth there to that secondary. They need some depth behind Tariq Woolen, Devin Witherspoon, and Michael Jackson. So I think those two guys definitely bring that to the table. When I look at this group, and trying to figure out who could potentially stick on this roster, it's interesting. I think Garrett Greenfield out of South Dakota State. This is a guy who was one of the better offensive tackles in all of FCS. And when I look at him, he was 6'6", 311, ran a 5'2", 240, but it was that 38.5-inch vertical leap that set a record for offensive linemen. FCS All-American. I look at him, there's Stone Forsythe, there's Raekwon O'Neal as the backup to Charles Cross. I think Garrett Greenfield is a guy that could end up as that backup when it's all said and done. I think he has that athleticism. I think he's a guy that could potentially find his way onto that roster. Nelson Caesar, a guy who had 9 sacks a season ago for the Houston Cougars. I honestly thought this guy was going to get drafted, but ultimately when I look at him, 6'3", 264. I think inconsistency. I think there was some stiffness to his game that ultimately found him falling down the draft board. One other guy to be mentioned, to make mention of, is Easton Gibbs out of Wyoming. He's 6 foot, 232 pounds. Another inside linebacker. I think he could potentially be that other backup. He's got John Radigan, Patrick O'Connell, Drake Thomas there at the inside backer spot. But I think he and Tyrus Knight could end up being those backups to Tyrell Dodson and Jerome Baker. And with Easton Gibbs, just instinctive. That's one thing that Wyoming is able to produce, man. From Logan Wilson to Chad Muma to Easton Gibbs. Easton Gibbs back-to-back years with over 100 tackles, 22 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 11 pass breakups in his career as well. Just another guy with a nose for the football. Some limitations athletically, and I think that's why he fell. 4'7", 340, but a guy that I think could be a special teams ace if nothing else. I think Tyler Matakevich, a guy that over 400 tackles there for Temple, and he's found a niche in the league as a backup linebacker and a special teams ace. So I think there are a couple of guys there that could find their way onto the roster in Seattle. San Francisco, hey, thought maybe they go tackle, but again, no tackles on the board in round 1 at that spot. Dominic Pooney, I think, will end up being that guard, though, in round 3. They're ultimately going to have him take over for John Feliciano and Spencer Burford. I fully think that's going to happen. You get Ricky Pearsall in round 1, Jacob Cowling in round 4. A couple of receivers, you don't know what the future is going to hold for both Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel. Renardo Green is a guy that I think could end up being that starter opposite Javarius Ward. Malik Mustafa could end up being the number 3 safety in that group as well. So some solid picks, nothing that was really flashy, but I think San Francisco, they stuck true to their board. That's really what it feels like when you look at that group. So when I look at who has, who to keep an eye on, for me it's Evan Anderson, the big mammoth nose tackle. You've got Malik Collins, you've got Javon Hargrave, there's Kevin Givens and Jordan Elliott. I think some of these guys are on, in their contract year. There's Kalia Davis, T.Y. McGill on the roster as well. And with Evan Anderson, this dude has some pretty impressive athleticism for a guy his size. He's 6'3", 356 pounds, 5.5 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks this past season. But here's what's even more impressive. As the nose for FAU, 58 tackles. So 58 total tackles. Putting that in perspective, that was number 5 on the team. And then those 3.5 sacks, second on the team for the Owls. So I look at him, that athleticism, he's a guy that is going to surprise and could find his way onto this roster when it's all said and done. Tampa, I mean, they get Graham Barton. He's going to be that, finally they get to replace Ryan Jensen at center. Chris Braswell, a little bit of a curious pick. Now look at him, he's stiffer than Shaq Barrett. Tyke Smith is a guy that I think will move into that nickel. And then Jalen McMillan, when you already have Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Trey Palmer. Jalen McMillan is the guy that's going to fill that slot role and be that number 4 receiver for them. I also like Bucky Irving, a guy who's going to, he catches a ton of footballs and will be that backup there for Rachaad White. So when I look at this group, I look at Judge Culpepper. He's a guy that definitely stands out to me. They've got William Golston backing up Logan Hall, who just hasn't panned out to this point. You've got Kalijah Cansey on the roster. But who's going to be that next guy to really emerge? And Judge Culpepper is interesting. He's out of Toledo. I want to look at Culpepper, 6'4", 290 pounds, transfer from Penn State, was there at Toledo the last 3 years, 10.5 tackles for loss, 9 sacks this past season. So a guy that showed that he can get after the quarterback. And I look at him, he has a chance. He has a chance to end up playing that 5 technique there in Tampa. I like that as a potential surprise on this roster, and a guy that can be incredibly productive for that team. Tennessee, thought either Joe Alt, Olu Fashanu, they go with J.C. Latham, a guy who he wanted to show everyone that he can play left tackle. I think that's ultimately where he's going to be. He'll be that starting left tackle for them. Loved that pick. Devondre Sweat, kind of a surprise, but look, they didn't shy away from Jeffrey Simmons. Devondre Sweat will be the starter playing next to Simmons. And then Cedric Gray, another guy who I think will end up being the starter next to Kenneth Murray at that inside linebacker spot. So 3 potential starters right there, right off the bat. So you love those pickups there. I look at a guy like Dylan Johnson. Tony Pollard, Tyjae Spears are your 1 and 2. You've got Hassan Haskins, but I look at Dylan Johnson, and what it feels like is, Hassan Haskins obviously has the inside track right now, but with Dylan Johnson, he's a similar running back, and he's got a lot of interesting ability, and what he has been able to showcase over his college career. Now, he's not the fastest guy by any means. Ran a 4.68 40 at 6 foot, 217 pounds. But you watched him at UW. The contact balance was ridiculous. A guy that was just running through tackles, could pick up yards in bunches. And look, that game against USC, 26 carries, 256 yards, 4 touchdowns. Yes, I know USC couldn't tackle anyone, but still, it was pretty impressive to watch. Went over 1,100 yards, just under 1,200 yards at 1,195, 16 touchdowns. This dude, though, before he came to Washington, showcased his prowess as a power back. Played for the late, great Mike Leach at Mississippi State and caught 149 passes for the Bulldogs. Ended up with 173 in his career. This guy can do a little bit of everything. And so that's something that I look at Tennessee. I think he has a chance to be a Hassan Haskins, to be that power back for Tennessee in that backfield. Washington Commanders. We knew they were going to take Jaden Daniels. I thought there were some other needs that they could have addressed, but they go with best player available in round 2, Jerzon Newton. Johnny Newton somehow falls to round 2. Looks like it may have been because of the foot injury. Ended up having to have surgery. Mikey Saber still is a guy that I think will end up being their nickel when it's all said and done. I mocked Ben Sinnott to Washington. That made a ton of sense to me. He's the guy that can come in and be that starter at the tight end spot. Yes, I know that they already have a starter right now in Zach Ertz, but Zach Ertz is not the long-term answer there at the tight end position. And then Brandon Coleman. He's a guy to be on the lookout for from TCU, a guy that I thought was really going to be a guard at the next level. But when you look at where this group is set up, because they've got Nick Allegretti, Sam Cosmi, Michael Dieter, Chris Paul, I think Brandon Coleman could potentially be that backup left tackle to Cornelius Lucas. Keep an eye out there. Love the Luke McCaffrey pick as well. He'll be a starter with Scary Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. So, who am I really looking at here with Washington? I look at Chigozie Anuzium out of Colorado State. That's really the guy that I'm targeting. 6'1", 200 pounds, has pretty good ball skills, excellent length. And when you look at this cornerback spot, you've got Benjamin St. Just, Michael Davis. There's Emmanuel Forbes, who's disappointed to this point. Igbenogany, Tarek Castro-Fields. I still think that they're looking for a young corner to come in and challenge for some playing time. And I think Anuzium is a guy that can end up coming in here and doing some of that work. I also look at the running back spot. You've got Austin Eckler, you've got Brian Robinson, Chris Rodriguez is another power back. Jeremy McNichols, I look at him and I think Michael Wiley has a chance to end up beating him out. Michael Wiley played at Arizona and 5'11", 207, and look, 123 receptions in his 5 years with the Wildcats. Not really a penchant for his prowess as a runner. It really was in a running back by committee. There were a lot of backs that were thrown your way, from Jonah Coleman to DJ Williams. But with Wiley, outside of 771 yards on the ground in 2022 with 8 touchdowns, he wasn't much of a runner, but the pass catching ability, his ability to make plays in that passing game as a route runner, as a guy that can make plays after the catch, that's where I look at Michael Wiley, and that's where I look at this roster and I say, you know what, Austin Eckler, they've got that guy obviously as your starter, but Brian Robinson, Chris Rodriguez, 2 power backs. You need another guy that could spell Austin Eckler in the passing game, and Michael Wiley can actually bring that to your roster. So those are all of the undrafted free agents that I've targeted for these teams to kind of be keep an eye out for during the camps, especially as we get into training camp, see where they actually fall. Do they end up either making that roster week 1? Do they fall to that practice squad, or do they end up moving to another roster? Because that's the other thing. If these guys play well, they show out, and hey, maybe there's not a roster spot here on this team, there are other teams that will be interested in these guys. And that's why the scouting departments, it's very important for them to have a list of these guys that they could potentially target that got picked up somewhere else. Hey, we know that if this guy gets released over here, we want to target him and bring him onto our roster, whether it's a practice squad or onto our 53-man roster when it's all said and done. So a lot to be on the lookout for as we head into training camp. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up this podcast. One last podcast before the 2024 podcast series is put to bed, and that's really looking ahead. I like to, on the last episode, take a look ahead to the 2025 draft, really an early look, very early look, but we're going to take a look at all of the positions. And really what I'll say is, if the narrative for the 2024 draft was all about the offense, 14 picks to start out the draft, and really what was crazy was 6 quarterbacks off the board in the first 12 picks. Never happened before. So I think this year it's going to be all about the defense. Really, that's where we're going to be looking. It's defense, defense, defense. I found as many as 12 edge rushers that you can make an argument for coming off the board in round number 1. Definitely not going to happen. There's some legit corners. We're going to see a couple of them come off the board in the top 10. It's all about the defense. I think there are at least 3 or 4, maybe even 5 defensive tackles that can come off the board in round number 1 as well. So we'll break everything down. There are a couple of quarterbacks to talk about as well in that top 10, that we have to make sure, one of them being Shedeur Sanders, Carson Beck being the other, but a lot of different guys to talk about. So we will bring that to you here shortly, and then we'll put to bed the 2024 podcast series, and then we'll get ready for the 2024